Hey, Trailblazers. In this episode, we're going to walk you through how to monetize podcast interviews and turn conversations into sales with Jessica Rhodes.
If you want to build a legitimate, profitable online business without shiny objects, without the hypey gimmicks, and without the stress and overwhelm, if you want to make more money without having to be present online all day, every day, pumping out content that nobody sees and hustling DMs to generate leads and sales, then this is the place for you. Welcome to the Digital Trailblazer Podcast, your online business university, where you'll learn how ordinary people start from ground zero with no influence, no email list or audience to sell to, and no business or marketing experience, and go from working 9-to-5 jobs to building successful 6- and 7-figure online businesses and all the steps in between. Learn the strategies that worked and what didn't. Learn the mistakes that they made and how to avoid them, and then learn their plans for scaling their businesses and taking things to the next level. All so that you can build your business faster and easier and make more money without sacrificing the things that are important to you in your life. I'm your host, Leah Ray Getz, and with me is my husband, Todd. Now, let's get to it with today's guest.
Welcome, Jessica. I'm excited for this conversation. We've seen podcast guesting, what we call as podcast guesting, or getting on people's shows, getting interviews, as something that's really exploded as a potential strategy, or at least something that people are very, very interested in doing. Yet, I feel like there's a lot of energy and time that people are putting into it and not actually getting a lot out of. So I think it's really important for us to have this conversation and look at, okay, if you're going to use this strategy, how do we actually make this make sense from a business perspective so you're not just burning through your time and money? So we're super excited to have you with us today. Now, you haven't, give a little context, like you haven't, tell them about your agency, and then we'll dive into all the good stuff here.
Yeah, I started Interview Connections in 2013. We were the first ever podcast booking agency, and I was actually a virtual assistant before I started my business as an agency owner. My dad was my first client. And at the time, there was nobody booking podcast interviews for entrepreneurs. So that's why I started the company. There was this interest and this demand for helping people get connected for podcast interviews. And over the last 12 years, over a decade of growing my agency and booking entrepreneurs on podcasts, we've seen that there's a real strategy for how to leverage podcast interviews and a podcast tour as a guest effectively. Like, I've seen a lot of people, they're getting into podcasting because the industry has absolutely exploded. The medium has exploded. So many people are hosting podcasts and so many people want to be a guest. And a lot of people are getting booked kind of just organically. They'll say, I've done 10, 20 interviews over the last year, and it's just people reach out to me. And it's sort of just by luck, by chance that they get bookings. But then when asked, have you gotten clients from it? What's your ROI? They're like, I haven't really seen any results from it. And that's why I do what I do and I talk about what I talk about, is because when you go into podcast guesting with a plan and with a strategy and with intention, it can become a very predictable source of leads and sales in your business.
So let's start at the beginning. How do you find shows to be on that will actually have potential when you do the everything else right, to actually lead to leads and sales?
Yeah. So number one, it takes having a plan and really being intentional about who you need to speak to based off of who your target audience is, what your goals are. So we walk through with our clients, and it's like what I do with my sales team. I like walk them through, what's the plan? How are you going to hit your sales goal? Who do you need to talk to? What do you need to talk to them about? What kind of touch point do you need to have? It's the same thing with podcast guesting. It's looking at, what is your goal for the strategy? For most entrepreneurs, it's, I want more clients. I want to get more clients. Okay, who's your ideal client? What are they interested in? What are their challenges in business? What types of podcasts are they listening to solve their problems and to overcome whatever challenges they have? What types of podcasts might they be hosting? Because a big monetization strategy is actually going on shows where the host of the podcast is an ideal client. And so once you know exactly who your target audience is, who your ideal client is, specifically as possible, right? Some people are like, I'm business owners. Like, I can work with any business owner. Like, get more specific. What are they interested in? What industries are they in? What topics are they most interested in? And then what types of podcasts are they listening to? What problems are they trying to solve? So what shows are they listening to? And then put together a podcast one sheet with topics and questions that those hosts could ask you. And this is super important because a lot of people make a one sheet or write out topics they could be interviewed on that are just self-serving or what they want to talk about. But what I teach entrepreneurs to do is to think about go all the way to the end of the funnel where you're on a sales call with an ideal client. And what are the objections that you're getting? Where is there a lack of understanding about the strategy that you help your clients with that is holding them back from having 100% trust in you helping them with said strategy? So, for example, if you're running paid ads, you have a marketing agency and you're running a paid ad strategy, people don't need to know exactly how to do the ads for themselves to hire you. That's why they're hiring you. But they need to have an understanding of how long is it going to take for them to see an ROI from ads? What is required of them as the business owner for them to outsource ads to you? Like all of this stuff, once they understand that, they can say, okay, I trust you and I want you to do it for me. So, if in this sales consultation you're getting a lot of objections and questions and people aren't quite getting it, then you go back to the top of the funnel where you can be doing podcast interviews, educating people about that so that once they get to a sales call, if they already heard you on a podcast, they're sold because they're like, oh, yeah, I heard you talk about that on a podcast. I totally get it. So now you don't have to have this whole educational presentation. You can just kind of get them across the finish line in that sales conversation.
Now, that brings to mind the question, which I'm sure the audience is thinking, do you have any specific tools or sites that you use to research what are those podcasts that you should be applying for?
Yeah. So there are so many different directories out there. I wish I could say, oh, this is the one site where everyone should go to find great podcasts. There are a lot of them now, and I'll give you some examples. Like when I first started, it was just going into Apple Podcasts and just trying to search, which wasn't even the best algorithm anyway. You would think it would be the best search algorithm, but or search tool. ListenNotes.com is a really great one. You know, we have a premium subscription to find shows for our clients. So Listen Notes is great because you can search even somebody's name. Like you can search Jessica Rhodes and then see all the podcasts that I was a guest on, as well as my own podcast will come up too. So that's really helpful because one tip for finding shows to be a guest on is looking at who else is similar to me, like what other experts, like who are my peers, who are my competitors, and then what shows are they getting interviewed on. So that's a nice little trick to see, like, what shows are a good fit. And you also want to make sure that, they're interview based, they're currently publishing, all that good stuff. So Listen Notes is a great one. And then there's paid directories like Rephonic, Rephonic. Rephonic is a directory that you can sign up and then get in and search different tools. So now that the podcast guesting industry is so established it's still a small new industry, but there are actually directories and software services that are made for people looking for shows to be a guest on.
Is there a certain size requirement that you guide your people to?
Yeah, I love this question. I did a whole episode of my podcast about this. We talked all about this because I am like, I will just die on this hill about like podcast audience sizes. So number one, as you both know, the number of downloads that your show has is only available to you as the owner of the podcast. You log into wherever you host the media and you can see how many downloads your show got in the last 30 days and, all time. I can log into my media host and see, okay, how many downloads. But nobody else can see that information. And so I always tell entrepreneurs, don't get caught up in trying to be on certain size podcasts because at the end of the day, you don't really know how big a certain show is. There are metrics that you can look at to guess, of course. If a show has 100 reviews on Apple Podcasts, like obviously it's probably going to have a bigger audience than a show with one review. But at the same time, you have to weigh different factors, right? Is the show with 100 reviews, does that actually have your ideal client listening to it? Or is it more of kind of a vanity ego play to say like, oh, I was on this really big show. Like my business partner and I were both on a show with 100,000 downloads a month. It's a huge podcast, but it just didn't have our target audience listening. Like it was relevant to us. Like our topic was definitely a good fit for the show, but we didn't get any leads from it. And we were like, well, yeah, our ideal client's just not listening to that show. Whereas I've gotten a bunch of leads from a really targeted like business podcast for lawyers, like super, super specific, but it was like probably, a few hundred lawyers listening, but they're all like, how do I grow my brand? And they're super interested in seeking services that they can hire to help them grow their brand. So There's no clear answer on how big a show needs to be. The one thing I do say is that avoid shows that have less than 20 episodes. Most people are going to quit before they hit 20 episodes. A lot of people quit before they hit 3 episodes. So, if you want to really prioritize more established podcasts, focus on the podcasters that have already been doing weekly episodes for at least 4 or 5 months. And that's kind of the 20 episode mark.
Actually, there was one podcast we've been on that was pretty widely syndicated. It had an audience size of at least tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. We were on it twice, and I think it was something about books for entrepreneurs or something like that. When those 2 episodes published, I don't know if we saw much of a jump at all in leads or listenership on our own podcast or anything. But then we've been on other podcasts where we definitely saw a jump, and we had no idea they had an audience that was anywhere near the size of ours even. So the other thing I was going to bring up was even the small podcast. If you're new to speaking online and being interviewed, even if you're not new to content creation, if you're new to being interviewed, it's a different process than creating your own content. And so I would say even just getting on those smaller podcasts or not worrying about the size, just to get the reps in, just to kind of get the feel of the process and how it goes and handling questions that are unexpected and what to say. Even just doing it to get the practice of responding to that and doing it in a way where you always sound good.
There's so much to be said for practicing. People think, oh, I just need to get on a couple top tier shows because they think it's a numbers game. And most of the time, they probably don't have a funnel that will effectively convert the number of people that they might convert from a top tier show. I mean, to your point, there are top tier shows where you're like, wait, I thought this was like a huge audience and I'm not getting any leads from it. But on the other token, if you get on a really big show and you're not set up, like maybe your website doesn't have an opt-in in a place where people could actually opt in. I was advising a client because we're going to promote him to our email list. And I said, you got to get that opt-in right at the center because nobody's going to go hunting for how they can book a call with you. You've got to make it easy. So it takes time to build up your online presence to the point where you can convert leads really effectively. And it also takes time to really hone your message. How are you answering questions? What stories are you sharing? Are you at the point where you're so well rehearsed that, no, you don't sound scripted, but you sound like a pro and you know what you're doing? Don't go to, we've all seen the Shark Tank entrepreneurs where their business literally crashes from the amount of traffic. They're just not ready for it. So there's a lot of value in going on small shows in the beginning to get yourself ready for the bigger platforms.
We've definitely had some guests on our show where I knew I asked them a tough question and they came back with an amazing answer. Then we've done the same thing to other people and they completely crashed and burned. And we had to cut that from the episode because we don't want to make anybody look bad. But, they were definitely not as prepared as some others. So, okay, next question. If we're starting to reach out to these podcasts to get booked on, how should we construct that pitch, especially if it's a bigger podcast that we know we might not have as good of a shot on? How do we pitch ourselves to give us the best shot of actually getting booked?
Yeah, the bigger the show that you're pitching, the more tailored and customized your pitch needs to be. Now, one helpful piece of information, I think, just important intel for really big shows is they want to see that the guest is going to bring equal value to their show. So that is either in, hey, I'm going to bring a really big audience to your podcast. A lot of top tier shows, they're not going to entertain a pitch from a guest who has less than the number of followers that they have. So they're going to want to see, for the most part, guests that have a pretty significant following. Now, if you don't have a big following on social media, you could still land really big shows, but you need to have what my friend Andy is in the podcast PR industry. She calls leverage. You've got to have leverage. What are you going to bring to their show that's going to bring them value? How are you going to bring them value? You can look up all of the episodes that they've done. Have they ever talked about your topic on the show? You could point that out. I mean, most websites you could search. So whatever your topic is, have they ever done an episode on that topic? If you can say, hey, I can see you've never done an episode about this topic. I think it's really valuable for your audience for this reason. That's a way that you can really stand out. What you talk about really relevant and timely. really big podcasts, they are very relevant. They want to be up on the trends and what people are talking about. So if you have a topic that's super timely and relevant, that's something to bring to their attention. And then short to the point. This is for big, medium, small podcasts. Podcast hosts are getting pitched a lot, dozens of times a week, sometimes dozens of times a day. They're getting a lot of pitches. And so you have got to get to the point, make sure it's relevant, make sure it's accurate, make sure they actually take guests on their show. I mean, a lot of this is basic, but do not waste their time. Be on point with your pitch and then follow up. We book about 300 interviews a month at our agency. 30% of the bookings we get come after we follow up with that host 2, 3, 4 times. So you definitely want to be following up with the host, reaching out to them on social media, bringing their attention to the pitch. I followed up with the host on LinkedIn. She goes, "Oh, thanks for following up. I saw that your pitch was in my spam folder." So it's just kind of like with sales outreach, you've got to be super, super thorough, tracking your outreach, following up, and being relevant.
So I think a question that people usually have is frequency. Like if they truly want to use this as one of their main lead generation strategies for their business, how many podcasts should they be on? How many pitches should they be doing? What does that actually kind of look like in sort of their DMO, if you will, for their business?
Yeah. So I find the sweet spot is anywhere from 2 to 4 interviews a month as a guest. I go on about 3 to 4 shows every month. I do batch them. So I'll record a lot of podcast appearances in 1 to 2 weeks of the month, and then I'll focus on other things in the other weeks. But about 3 to 4 a month. Part of that is just for visibility purposes. You want to be that visible and you want to be out there reaching as many audiences as possible. But the other reason is to stay practiced. I took like a year or so off of podcast guesting. I was just super in the trenches of building our sales team, and I just didn't have it in me to also be doing podcast interviews. And let me tell you, when I got back into podcasting, I was rusty. I was like, wait, how do I do this? And so when you do it a lot, you get really good. It's just like with anything, practice makes progress, practice makes perfect. So the more you do it, the better you get. And you keep this flow of leads coming in because you're not turning off the tap. Like with paid ads, if you stop paying Facebook, they tend to stop running your ads. But when you're on podcasts, you keep that visibility high. And then as far as the number of pitches, I mean, our team has about, I would say, a 20% success rate of sending pitches to actually bookings landed. And that can fluctuate. Like if we're going after shows we've never had a relationship with before, if it's a really big show we've never booked on, obviously the success rate is going to be lower versus a host that we already have a relationship with. But that's something that if you are pitching and booking yourself, track all of your metrics, track the number of pitches you're sending out, track the number of bookings that you're getting in, and that will just give you that formula of how much output you need to get the bookings that you want to hit on a monthly basis.
Yeah, I think that tracking piece is super important, especially if you're doing at least one a week or sometimes even more. I know that we've had people on our podcast, and when we ask them about what they're doing, they're like, yeah, I've done one a day for the past month or whatever. And it's like, they're really on a tear with this podcast guesting thing. You've really got to keep track of the podcast that you've been on. When did you record the episode? When did it publish? Who do you promote to? Because one of the things that we really appreciate as hosts is when we bring a guest on that they actually promote the episode. And if you're just going on a bunch of podcasts and there's no reciprocation there, kind of like you said, there needs to be some value that you're bringing in order to get on some of those bigger podcasts. If there's no reciprocation, there's very little chance that we're going to recommend you or even have you on again as a guest if we notice that, okay, well, we published the episode and everything. We took our time and resources to create the episode, to edit it and do all this stuff and then to publish it. And then there was nothing on the other end. So keeping track of that, especially when you're very busy, is so important. And then also to track your results. You can only improve what you measure, right? What is the saying? You cannot improve that which you do not measure. Is that what they say?
Yeah, I was just listening to a podcast yesterday called What Gets Measured, like as a marketing show, like you got to measure all of your data points. And yeah, I totally agree. Like a podcast interview, it's a co-creation and the host is doing so much of the heavy lifting in terms of planning the episode and producing it and creating the clips and everything. And I'm such a big proponent for guests actually promoting the episodes and sharing them and, not only posting them on social media, but using those interviews in your marketing content. I mean, I will send podcast appearances that I've done as a guest to leads before they have a sales call. Say, hey, listen to this interview. I'll use them as nurture content before a launch. So we run paid ads to our free masterclass. So we end up having thousands of people registered. And then I'll send out an SMS text and I'll say, hey, listen to this episode. So, and I'll let the host know that because they're not going to see that on social media. But I'll say, hey, just so you know, if you see a spike in downloads, I just texted it to 2,000 people. And they're like, oh, that's great, And so finding ways you can use it, because I have seen, in our show, we'll have higher downloads on episodes where I'm promoting the show to a really targeted audience. So if I'm doing some LinkedIn prospecting or sending out a DM to people on LinkedIn, I'll say, hey, I have this episode about XYZ. Would you like the link? And they're like, yeah, I would like the link. And then I'll send that episode out and I'll see way more downloads on that show. And so as a guest, if you don't have your own show, do that with the appearances you've done, and you'll get a lot more visibility for your story because you're going to share different type of value and different type of content when you're interviewed versus when you're just making your own videos.
As part of that reciprocation piece, is it really beneficial to have your own podcast that you can have other people as a guest on as well? Because I've seen that as well. Sometimes when we're applying to be a guest on other people's podcasts, that's one of the questions they may ask on their form is, do you have a podcast that we could do maybe a swap with or something? Is that something you recommend people do? Or is it like, yeah, I could do it or not? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think like with any marketing strategy, I always say like you have to want to do it and you have to be into it, like if somebody's like, I don't really want to be interviewed, but I hear it works. I'm like, it ain't going to work for you if you don't want to do it. So I think with a podcasting is such a powerful medium and it's such an effective marketing strategy if you want to do it. And it is a lot of work. I mean, we all know, like I have a podcast, you guys have a podcast. You've got to organize, create the show notes, get the graphic ready, have somebody post it to the website, have somebody edit the audio, promote it. Like it does take a lot. Now, is it effective? 100%. But if you're not going to do it consistently, it's not going to be effective. For us, like we do co-hosted episodes, my business partner and I, so we're not bringing guests on our show. So if a host is like, oh, I'll have you on if it's a swap, I might have to say, thanks, but no thanks, maybe sometime in the future. So the swap thing doesn't always work out. If it does, great. But you bring up a good point. It is always good to look for ways to collaborate with the host of the show. Like I've had podcast hosts come in and do, trainings for my client community. It's not like every single host that interviews me does that, but you feel it out. Like with some guests, I'm sure you really collaborate with and you're like, oh, this was just such a great connection. And other guests, it's like, oh, this is a great episode, but we'll see where it goes. But just looking for ways that you can collaborate with the people you're connecting with through podcasting, that's how you monetize the strategy, is really focusing on the networking and relationship building that comes out of it.
Yeah, I will say that from our end as hosts, the people that we've connected with have really helped us in our business in other ways other than just the episode. Just with the networking on the back end, learning new strategies, talking after the episode and just kind of learning more about the inside stuff that they didn't want to actually share on the episode. We've learned a lot of stuff that has really helped us in our business and build relationships that still continue to this day. So let's get into the actual content of the episode, because I know that sometimes people have the expectation of, oh, if I just get exposure, that's all I need and people will magically want to sign up. The first thing you said is you got to come in with a plan. So when you're in the episode, what is it that you want to say? Like, I'm sure there's not magic words, but what are the magic words that we say to get clients from this thing?
Yeah. So first, I just want to emphasize how important it is to commit to this long term and to practice, because you're not going to nail every interview, and it's going to take practice and consistency to get to the point where you've really nailed your messaging and you figured out kind of that perfect balance and recipe of information, stories, and call to action. And those really are the three things. It's giving valuable information, like when you're asked a question, giving actionable tips. Like you want the listeners to feel like, wow, I got a lot of value from that episode. I can implement what I learned in that episode. It wasn't just some fluffy overview of the benefits of something. It's like I could actually go to listennotes.com and start searching for shows. Like I want people to walk away from an interview feeling like, even if they never get in touch with me, that was valuable and that was a good episode. So there's information, but there's also that old saying, facts tell, but stories sell. So your information alone is not going to motivate and inspire someone to want to invest in your program or your offer. You also need to share stories. And the purpose of stories is to bring to life what you do, to show people what you do, not just tell them what you do, and to also allow people to see themselves as your client. And so what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example. So years ago, probably like 2016, I'm a pretty new entrepreneur and I'm just listening to podcasts. I'm listening to so many podcasts. Like that was a new mom. I had a baby. Like that was my way of expanding my world and connecting with entrepreneurs, like the virtual connections of like hearing them on podcasts. And one of the shows that I was listening to, every single episode that came out, Allie Brown's podcast, Glambition Radio. I listened to every single episode. I listened to her interviewing. She primarily had her clients on. And so she would interview them, got a ton of value. They're sharing stories of here's how you helped me, Allie. Here's how I grew my business. Here's how you helped me reach, multiple seven figures. And so here I am as this like new entrepreneur. I'd probably just hit six figures. And I'm like picturing myself hitting seven figures. And who do I picture helping me hit seven figures? Allie Brown, of course, because she's I'm like her coaching client, but I'm just listening to her podcast. I'm picturing myself in the seat of all of her clients. So then when I was ready to make an investment in a business coach, I went to her website and filled out the application. I probably heard her call to action to download her like tips for success. I remember it. What has it been, 10 years that I remember the CTA that she gave on her podcast? Every single episode, she said, go here. And I think it was some type of tips for success. I never opted in for it. But when I was ready, I filled out an application and I invested $15,000 to do an in-person VIP day with her. I went from listening to her podcast every single week, never opting into her email list, but then went right to signing up and becoming her client, and then upgraded into her $50,000 offer 2 years in a row. It was through listening to her talk with her clients on her podcast, hearing their stories. That's what moved me. And so you have to incorporate stories of your clients, of how you help people. And again, it's an art, it's a balance, because you can't just be like, this is how I help my client do this. It's like, okay, that just feels like a testimonial to close somebody, but like become really good at storytelling. Take a course in storytelling, practice it, like really hone that craft, because stories are what will move people to see themselves as your client.
Like you said, facts tell, stories sell. There's a big difference between giving a description of what you did to help somebody versus telling the story. And the difference is that stories invoke emotion. And what people don't realize is that people make decisions based on emotion. And then they back it up later with whatever facts and whatever studies and whatever proof they need later on to justify it. But the initial decision is an emotional decision to fulfill some sort of human need. Even people who are really analytical, people like doctors, engineers, they still make decisions based on emotions to fulfill a human need. And people don't realize that. They think that what's going to motivate a highly analytical person is facts. And it's not. It's still stories. And when you tell a story, what happens is just like you did. People imagine it in their minds. They can envision themselves in that situation. They feel the emotions of it actually happening.
Yeah, totally. You create sense memories for people. I will remember exactly where I was when I heard certain stories on podcasts from like 5-10 years ago. I'll think of a story and I'm like, I remember where I was. Like what's coming to my mind is like, I remember being in my kitchen of my starter home when I listened to Biz Women Rock, was one of the first business women podcasts that was out there and that I was listening to. And I'm listening to her interview. Like I can remember like what other marketing is out there that will have your audience remembering the time, place, and moment, like season, day, everything. I remember all the details of when I heard certain stories on podcasts. Like I can't think of a single marketing strategy that creates that amount of emotional connection with your marketing.
Now, one of the other things you mentioned was having a good call to action and funnel and everything to actually bring the leads in afterwards. What do you suggest people use for a call to action? Because I've seen people come in with all sorts of things. Sometimes it's, just check out my website, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn, just send me a message. And then some other people are like, download my freebie. And I created a special link just for Digital Trailblazer listeners and all this stuff. So what level of preparedness do you need to go through here? And what do you suggest people do?
So I'm laughing because the story that I just shared, I remember their call to action. So she's interviewing the founder of this company called Zero Shoes, like XERO. And it's like the sandals that are just like conformed to your feet. It feels like you're barefoot. And their call to action was they did a giveaway. And so you had to send an email or do something to enter the giveaway. And I won the giveaway. So that's a good call to action, something that people want. I heard that and I was like, I want one of those shoes. So I'm going to enter the giveaway. So your call to action, there's no one size fits all. There's no like everyone needs an opt in, everyone needs a freebie. It has to make sense for your business and your brand and who your target audience is and what they would need to get closer to wanting to sign up with you. Right. So for this company, it was like letting people try out the product, letting them experience it. That's going to get them closer to actually buying it again or buying it for the first time. So we do have clients that will just say, like, connect with me on LinkedIn because for them, it's just brand awareness. They just want people following them. They know if people are following them on LinkedIn, they'll eventually see their post, they'll reach out. So that works for them. For others, it's a lead magnet. It's getting people onto their email list with a specific lead magnet. I have a podcast prep checklist. So if people hear my interviews, they tend to want some real tools and tips like written down step by step. So I have a checklist and you just want to give away your call to action at a URL that's easy to remember. Because if it's hard to spell or hard to remember, something that's super simple and easy.
So one of the other things I was wondering about is if you're just starting this journey and you're brand new and you pitch a bunch of podcasts and maybe you don't get on some of the ones that you want to, can you come back later on, maybe when you've got more of an audience? Is it okay to pitch yourself again a second time later on, maybe when you've got more to offer? Are they going to remember that they rejected you the first time? Or even if you did get on a podcast once, is it good to come back later on, maybe several months later or a year later and try to get on the same podcast again?
Yeah, so we'll kind of approach those two different scenarios. So number one, if you pitch yourself to a show and they say no, I always like to find out why. Sometimes they're like, it's just not a fit. And you're like, okay, are there other topics that you're looking to do episodes on, or are you just not open to guests right now? So I just try to get more information from the host because some hosts will say, like, just for some reason, they have a hard time just being honest with why they're saying no to you, like whether it's in a sales context or, pitching to be on a podcast. But if the host is open to it, you could just ask, is it just not the right time for this topic? Would you be open to me following up maybe 6 months or 12, a year down the road? Doesn't hurt to ask, but I would ask permission because it might be a little tone deaf if you just like pitch again. You're like, I know you said no last year, but can we try this again? So you can ask the host if they'd be open to it. Now, if you've been on a show, 100%. This is why I say that if you have a book coming out, go on podcasts a year before your book comes out because you can go back to those same hosts and say, hey, I know you had me on a year ago. My book is coming out. I've got some new topics. Would you be open to having me back on the show a second time? We see a lot of our clients going on shows multiple times just because by the end of the show, the host is like, wow, we need to have you back. Like, this was great. So that happens a lot of times naturally, but you want to organize all of your bookings, like have a spreadsheet where you're organizing and keeping track of all the shows that you're doing, the date that you recorded your episode with them, the date that it went live. And so that way, if you're like, oh, I want to go back to a lot of hosts that already had me on, you can look back at the dates and repitch, go back to them with a good plan based off of how long it's been.
So sort of a tactical question then, because we've talked a lot about tracking. So if you're setting up this spreadsheet for yourself, what are all of these data points or these columns, if you will, for the data nerds out there who are like, yep, I'm going to do it. We're going to track this, get really serious. What are all the columns they should have on their spreadsheet?
Yeah. So with the code track, we call it a code tracker because we're tracking it with our clients, but we're putting the name of the show, the website for the show, or the Apple Podcast link, whatever link is going to bring you to the show. We have the host name or the booker name or the booker name. Sometimes they have somebody booking the interview and then that's different from the host. The email. And so that way, you know who you're reaching out to. We also put the scheduling link on there, the date of the actual booking being secured. So let's say they email you back and they're like, yes, we want to have you on the show. Okay, May 9th, 2025. And that way, if they don't give you that scheduling link right away, you can follow up. And then we put the date that the interview is being recorded and then the date that it goes live. I find that super helpful to track because over time, it's about 3 months usually from the date that it gets connected to the date that it ultimately, and then when it goes live, right? So the date that you're booking the show, the date that you're recording, the date that it actually gets published. And then some people like to do individual calls to action for different shows, or maybe you have a few different CTAs. You're like, okay, I have a quiz, I have a lead magnet, I have a book a call, and depending on the show that I'm on, I'll give a different call to action. So maybe you also want to track which call to action you're going to use for those shows. You can also put the links to the host social media because it should be practice to follow them on Instagram, connect with them on LinkedIn. So that way, when you do a post promoting the episode or promoting the fact that you got booked, you can tag them accordingly. And then the reason I talked about CTA there is because some people will want to track individual shows. I don't personally recommend that because I have enough to track that I don't need to zero in and say, like, how well did this show perform? Because it's an overall strategy. Some individual podcasts are going to move the needle more than others, but I'm not going to stop podcast guesting because one show didn't perform as well. I usually will know which shows were a better fit just based off of the vibe with the host. Like, did I feel like that interview was like really on point, or was it just like, it was okay? And then once you're getting leads from podcast guesting, you'll be able to talk to the people and say, hey, which show did you hear me on? And then that's just the best feedback that you can get. Because usually podcast guesting is a lower quantity in terms of leads, but higher quality. Like, people reach out and they just like go right to a consult because they heard you and they're pretty much sold. And then lastly, if you do have a call to action or a specific landing page, like my podcast prep checklist, that landing page, I pretty much only use it on podcasts for the most part. So when I look at the traffic and conversion, I know that, okay, this is mostly my organic traffic from podcasts. And that's kind of how I assess the performance of the strategy.
Awesome. I love it. Thank you so much. Jessica, this has been just chock full of information. I think our audience is taking a lot of notes and might have to re-listen to this a few times. So we really appreciate it, Jessica. So tell people where to go if they want to check you out.
Of course. It wouldn't be a meta podcast episode if I didn't give a call to action. So as mentioned, I give a podcast interview prep checklist. So if you want all of our tips on how to prepare for your interview so you do a great job and you make the most of it, we have a checklist at interviewconnections.com/prep.
Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Digital Trailblazer podcast. For show notes and information about today's guest, head to digitaltrailblazer.com. Now, if you love this episode, if you got some value, make sure you leave us a review and subscribe. And be sure to share this episode with anyone you know who could use help to build their business. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.